In this video, I'm going to share all the available options to handle the UAT phase in Scrum and help you pick the one that suits your team the best. User acceptance testing, or UAT, is the final stage in the software testing process. It's typically done by the end user or client to determine if the application, what was produced, what was coded, meets its purpose. In the waterfall methodology, the UAT must be completed before the software can be released to the market. But what about Agile? What about Scrum? How do you handle UAT in the Scrum framework? According to the leading international testing organization, user acceptance testing, UAT, is formal testing with respect to user needs, requirements, and business processes conducted to determine whether or not a system satisfies the acceptance criteria and to enable the user, customers, or other authorized entity to determine whether or not to accept the system. Now, let's quickly look at the differences between how to handle UAT in the waterfall model compared to the Scrum framework. In the Scrum framework, UAT begins as soon as we write the user story. As soon as we write the user story and the acceptance criteria is in the user story. UAT is also done every single sprint. Developers, business people, testers, the product owner, developers, the QA if you have one, all of them working together every single sprint to do the testing, the whole testing flow every single sprint. You compare that to waterfall, where UAT begins at a later stage. The end users, the clients will do the UAT. They only see the acceptance criteria at the end when we're doing the UAT at a later stage prior to the end of a project. And because of this, defects are identified late, compared to Scrum, where defects are identified earlier simply because we are doing UAT every single sprint. And one of the main reasons why we can do that when using the Scrum framework is because of the way we write user stories. Yeah, product backlog items, user stories are written by first describing the user. When we describe the feature, then we say why the user wants to use this feature. What's the end goal of a user? We also talk about acceptance criteria as clearly written in the product backlog item, in the user story, what needs to happen for us to accept, for a product owner or the client or the end user to accept this development, accept this software, accept the final product, both functional and non-functional requirements. Now, let's quickly read again the definition of UAT. Formal testing with respect to user needs, requirements, and business processes conducted to determine whether or not a system satisfies the acceptance criteria and to enable the user, customers, or other authorized entity to determine whether or not to accept the system. All of these things are already in the user story, except for processes, but this also can be included, the change in the process can be included in the user story. So at the start of a sprint, prior to picking up a user story, you already have all this information to enable the user to test and ensure that the final product meets the requirements, meets the acceptance criteria. But when does the end user do that? When does the client do that? When do we do this UAT thing? In the sprint, together with the development of a feature, after the development of a feature, in the next sprint, 2 sprints after, 4 sprints after, at the end of a project. How do we handle that in Scrum and in Agile? This is where there's a lot of confusion. To try to answer this question, let's get back to the sprint. Why do we sprint? Why do we sprint in the first place? We are trying to achieve 2 things. First, a sprint goal. We decided in the sprint planning that we would commit on a sprint goal. And by the end of a sprint, we want to complete together this sprint goal. And second, we want to build a potentially shippable increment of a product. These 2 things will allow us to say that we had a successful sprint. So how do we do these 2 things? Let's get back to the user story. Contains what the user needs, who is the user, why the user wants that, how to do it, and how to accept the change. What needs to happen for the user to say, okay, this development, this software meets my requirements. That's the acceptance criteria. We need to ensure, in order to meet the sprint goal and also build this shippable increment of a product, that all the user stories required to do that are done, completed by the end of a sprint. Once all the user stories are done, we can say that they meet the sprint goal, and we can also merge everything together and release the software. But what is done? What does done mean in this context? Prior to starting the sprint, prior to picking up user stories to start the development, we need to agree on the definition of done. Yeah, definition of done between the product owner, the team, the end user, everyone involved. We need to agree what does done mean. It can mean different things. technical things, business things, technical things like we need to test on different environments, business things, we need to meet all the acceptance criteria. All the team needs to do is to agree, have a mutual understanding of what does done mean, and we need to ensure by the end of a sprint that this mutual understanding, the definition of done, is met for all the user stories required in order to meet the sprint goal and also build this potentially shippable increment of a product. If this is done correctly, we've done a successful sprint. But does this sound like UAT to you? Some say yes, others no. Some people believe that the product owner accepting the development, accepting the final software prior to releasing it is enough for us to release it to the production environment. Acceptance criteria, meeting the definition of done, that's enough, that's the UAT. Others believe that the end user or the client or both need to accept. They need to go through this UAT phase, same as the waterfall model, prior to releasing the software to the production environment. We already talked about the first option. You do that in the sprint. Simple. You just get the user story to done. Everyone has accepted that the whole team is satisfied, we can release to production. Now, if an end user needs to get involved, it gets a little bit more complex, simply because you are adding an additional dependency, especially dependency outside the team. People outside the team required for us to end the process. Because if we say that the definition of done needs to include the end user testing or the customer testing, it becomes complex. Again, back to why we sprint, meeting the sprint goal and also building this potentially shippable increment of a product. And in order to do these two things, we need to get user stories to done. And in order to get user stories to done, meet the definition of done, which includes UAT, the end user testing. So basically, if you're running a 1 week sprint or a 2 weeks sprint, you need to include the user in this time frame. And users, business users, customers need to be in your planning session. They will be involved, right? So they need to be included in your planning session. We need to agree how we'll communicate together with them. Maybe they need to join the daily scrums. And they have other things to do. They're not just waiting idle and waiting to test your software. It becomes complex because dependencies external to the team. People required external to the team. The team is no longer cross-functional. The team alone cannot do everything. They need other people outside to do it. It becomes complex. This is dependencies kill Scrum. To try to manage all these issues, I've seen teams running 1 month sprints. Hear me out. They run 1 month sprints. They do 2 weeks of development. Then they do 1 week of QA, the QA phase, and then 1 week of UAT. Yeah, the full month. Different phases. What does it sound like to you? The waterfall model. That's not Agile. In Scrum, we do everything together. Why? Because we want to get things done. We don't want to get things in work in progress. You realize that in development, the first thing completed, first day of a sprint, in week 1, will remain open for 1 month. That's not Agile. I know other teams that modified the definition of done. Yes, Scrum teams removed UAT from the definition of done. UAT is still needed in order to release something, but it's no longer part of the definition of done. What does done mean in order to complete user stories in a sprint? No longer part of that. So they start their sprint, they complete user stories, they meet the definition of done, not the UAT, the definition of done, and then in another process, somewhere else in parallel, there's the UAT being done for all the user stories that were completed. Again, what's the goal of a sprint? Meet the sprint goal and build this potentially shippable increment of the product. Are we doing that here? No, we are not. Simply because we need to complete the UAT in order to release it. So in the sprint, we will never be able to say that it's potentially shippable because UAT is not done in the sprint. It doesn't go into the definition of done. Again, waterfall. Different phases, not Agile. We are simply keeping things work in progress. What happens if a UAT spans across multiple weeks? 3 weeks later, we find a bug when doing the UAT and the team is already in another sprint. They are developing a new feature. We tell them, stop. There's a bug we found in the UAT for a feature that you developed 1 month back. Now we need to fix it. Stop what you're doing. We need to fix it. This causes a lot of problems simply because we have a lot of work in progress. Work that is not done. Again, Scrum is not a process. It's a framework. Scrum doesn't tell you to do UAT or doesn't tell you not to do UAT. It's just a framework, but Scrum is immutable. If you want the benefits of Scrum, you need to follow it as per the book, as per the Scrum Guide 2020. And the Scrum Guide says, again, meeting the sprint goal and building a potentially shippable increment of a product. 2 things. And if you can't do that in the sprint, because you need to do UAT or any other things, you're not following Scrum. And if you're not following Scrum, you might not be getting the benefits of Scrum. So I recommend you do the UAT in the sprint itself and get things done. Which brings me to my next point. If you want more tips, insights on Agile Scrum personal growth, click on the video that stands out the most on the screen right now, and I'll see you in a few seconds.